January 6th, 2021. First one of the year. So very excited to welcome you for our first event of the new year. As the editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, I just want to point out we cover these issues. We cover tech policy, broadband policy, how we get better broadband, better lives, and how it gets used, the application, adoption, use of broadband technologies on Broadband Breakfast every day. We have an exceptional panel for the third and final of our series, Broadband and the Biden administration. In part one, back in November, right after the election, we had two people who were involved in the planning teams, landing teams, or transition teams for the Obama and Trump administrations. In part two, in December last month, we had industry officials in the telecom and technology industry talking about the Biden administration. And today we've got three people in the think tank advocacy world, nonprofit world, who will be speaking with us about what the Biden administration will be doing and why and how broadband fits into those plans. I would call all of your attention to a story we just published yesterday on Broadband Breakfast about the role that broadband might play in all of the Biden-Harris administration policies. And that may set the stage for some of our discussion, or we'll see where we go with this. If you are not one of the panelists, we invite you to make sure your video is off. There will be a point later in the discussion where you'll have the opportunity, if you want, to ask a question on camera. Otherwise, we just invite you to watch, interact through the chat mechanism, and or send your tweets to Broadband Live. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and focus on all three of our panelists. Chris Lewis, who is the president and CEO of Public Knowledge. Shane Tews, who is the, got her title on our page here, we got to get to it, who is the visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also president of Logan Circle Strategies. And finally, last but not least, Joshua Steger, who's senior counsel at the at New America's Open Technology Institute. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Chris. Tell us a little bit about Public Knowledge, what it is and what your goals and principles are, and maybe just a little bit about yourself too, Chris, because it's only a year, or is it more or less, that you've been at the head of the organization. Tell us a little about your background and some of the priorities that you're bringing to Public Knowledge. So take it away, Chris Lewis.
Sure, and thanks for inviting me to participate, Drew. Public Knowledge turns 20 years old this year, which is exciting for us. And as you mentioned, I've been in the role of president and CEO for about the last year and a half. I'm our third president and CEO, coming off, following behind my friend Gene Kimmelman and our founder Gigi Sohn. Our mission is to promote and develop policies that promote free expression online and an open internet and affordable access to communications tools and creative works. And that's had us for the last 20 years really doing a lot of work in both copyright, intellectual property policy, as well as tech and telecom broadband policy, which we're going to talk about today. So we're very interested in how to protect consumers' rights based on those fundamental values.
Well, I'm going to date myself, Chris, but I remember many talks with Gigi Sohn when she started Public Knowledge, and I remember how much copyright issues occupied the mind space, the advocacy efforts, primarily because there was not an effective group pushing back against sort of entertainment interest, copyright maximalists, and Public Knowledge kind of leapt into that void. Obviously, you were doing a lot even early with telecom. How would you characterize the sort of change or transition of the priorities of Public Knowledge over, let's just say, the last 5 years to today?
Yeah, I think, our issue set has broadened, but we still work on those core issues. I was in a meeting this morning with our team talking about copyright reform and and some of the policies that hopefully the new Congress will be looking at in a positive direction. So, I think it's important that when we think about the values of making sure everyone is connected to an internet that allows independent and diverse voices to be heard, that it's not just connectivity to broadband, but it's also other issues around making sure the law promotes free expression, that we're not limited as we see digital tools move into as we see digital tools develop, that the laws around copyright, the laws around antitrust, which have been real hot in the last year that we've certainly been talking about, that they are updated for the ways that the technology is changing. And we see that across those different issue buckets. So our issues have broadened, but the mission stays the same. And we still are working on some of those core copyright issues, including, or in addition to the broadband issues.
Okay, well, we'll talk quite broadly about all these issues next, but let's let everyone get on the stage and say a little bit about themselves. Shane, tell us a little bit about American Enterprise Institute, your role there, and maybe some of the kind of the security question that we were chatting about just a moment ago.
Drew, thanks for having me on. The American Enterprise Institute was started after World War II as a free market think tank, and there's two sides to the house. It's there's an economic division, which I am part of, and there's also the foreign and defense policy team. And it's basically the idea was you take a bunch of smart people and throw them in a place and see how things go. One of the great things about AEI is we're all individual scholars, so I can say and do what I wish. And one of my colleagues may not agree with me, makes for some really good internal discussions some days, but it also means that there's a lot of good collaboration with my partners on, I spent a lot of time on trade, on international trade, as well as we've been speaking quite a bit lately about cybersecurity and the challenges that we have, especially because the government up until late has really looked at cybersecurity as a government issue separate from a commercial market space. And we know that the rest of the world doesn't look at cybersecurity that way, especially the Russians and the Chinese. And they actually use that division as a weakness in how we handle cybersecurity. So that's a big topic for us these days.
Well, good. I mean, we're going to have so much to talk about, I know, but I'd love to get your thoughts as well on how a more broad purpose think tank. Again, you mentioned AEI dates back to the Second World War. You clearly come at it from a free market / conservative standpoint, but today, who knows what that means, right? I mean, there's so much ferment in the underlying tectonic plates of our political economy that it's unclear to me which party, Republican or Democratic, sort of stands more for such principles. So I don't know if you want to react to that now or just kind of keep that in mind as we talk further about broadband and its role in tech policy.
That's a whole huge discussion. Let's not go there right now.
All right. Well, I can't help myself because we're now
absolutely.
we're obviously at a moment with the elections last night in Georgia where it is quite possible, perhaps even likely, that the Democrats will retake the Senate, and that presents a completely different set of underlying circumstance for broadband in the Biden administration. With that intro, Josh, tell us a little bit about Open Technology Institute, the New America Foundation, and some of the ways that you're approaching technology and telecommunications policy issues.
Sure. Well, thanks, Drew, for having me. The Open Technology Institute was founded in 2009 as part of the New America think tank, which is based in Washington, D.C. And over the past 11 years, we've been very involved in various fights for digital equity, so net neutrality, fighting consolidation in the broadband market, and securing free expression online. So looking forward to the incoming Biden administration and the next Congress, we are going to be continuing the fights to close the digital divide, the pandemic and beyond, and many of the issues that both Chris and Shane touched upon.
So would it be fair to characterize Open Technology Institute as a think tank within a think tank, or do you have a little bit more practical mission too?
Yeah, I think think tank within a think tank is a pretty good description. We're pretty focused on advocacy within DC, on Capitol Hill and the administration and at the regulatory agencies.
Well, and I know there's been some transitions in the last year and a half, but OTI was also involved in the founding of Measurement Lab, which is an organization that measures broadband speeds and availability. Do you want to speak to that? Again, I know it's spun off, no longer part of OTI, but that was definitely been in the mix for the past decade, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was something that we incubated at OTI for quite a few years, Measurement Lab, or MLab as we call it, the world's only open source measurement platform for internet speeds. And we've worked for many years on helping them uncover interconnection abuses that were happening in 2013 and 2014, various issues around some of the broadband mergers. And yeah, about 2 years ago now, the incubation period ended and they spun off as independent entities. So we're pretty proud of that project.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. Chris, we'll turn to you. Tell us the role that broadband will and should play in the Biden administration.
Well, from what we hear from the Biden team and what they've written in their plans, it should play a large role because, as was said in the article that you shared, Drew, broadband is really a tool that society uses for so many things, and it touches so many different parts of our lives that it is truly an essential service, that it's important that everyone has access to it. And it seems like that primary goal will be front and center for a Biden administration. How do we make sure that everyone is connected to broadband, and they're connected to broadband that is secure, that is open, that is affordable, and that is reliable, and all of those things go together. And so, I expect that the Biden administration will be working with all stakeholders to put forward plans to not only fund broadband deployment and give the subsidies and the support that's needed to make sure that everyone is connected, but also hopefully the policies and even regulations that can promote and support universal connectivity. Money is not enough. There are other reasons why there's a digital divide out there, and whether it's the affordability question or whether it's the choices that broadband providers make and which neighborhoods they serve. Digital redlining is a real problem in many areas, but it's been highlighted in certain urban areas through studies over the last couple of years, as well as making sure that people are prepared to use the technology. The digital literacy is important. So all of those contribute to the digital divide, and with a focus on that, we can make sure that everyone has connectivity to broadband to support education, to support economic development, to support healthcare. Like I said, it touches so many parts of our lives.
From a policy and legislative perspective, Chris, would it be better, more effective for the administration to focus on infrastructure, new infrastructure deployment, or on, let's just call it, subsidization, promotion of the use of technology that exists already?
Right. I think we need to do all of those. The idea that there are different contributing factors to the digital divide means that we can't just have one solution because it will not touch all of those symptoms or all of those factors that are keeping people disconnected. So funding, I think, is important, but we'd love to see some rules around the reliability of the network and the quality of the broadband that's provided. We'd also love to see some rules about making sure that everyone in service areas are served, and that you can't leave out, especially when we're subsidizing or making plans to do more subsidies to deploy broadband, especially when we're providing licenses to companies to help them build wireless networks. It's important that there are public interest obligations that make sure that everyone is served with quality broadband.
Shane, let me ask the same question of you. What are your thoughts about the deployment versus adoption use dilemma? And do you agree or disagree with the notion that broadband needs to be an important priority for the Biden administration?
Oh, I absolutely agree that broadband needs to be a priority for everyone, whatever administration we're in. I think that the pandemic has really shown us the importance of broadband, and it's in many ways leaped certain industries forward that weren't as excited about the digital economy as I am on a daily basis. But I do think from a macro perspective, we have the availability versus adoption things that we need to look at. So one of the things I think is very important here is broadband mapping. And we look at where are we spending government money, what government money is coming forward, and what are the rules and regulations around that. And maybe we do need to look at subsidies in certain areas. When you're having to choose what to spend money on, this still isn't a priority. Or with a lot of changes in education, people working from home, we've got a lot of more healthcare opportunities now through telemedicine. There's more of a desire to have broadband connections directly to your house. The question becomes though, like how prescriptive do we want our government entity to be? Because we're seeing mobile broadband is competing with fixed wire into the house. Low level satellites are definitely having a bit of a heyday, and there's areas, in rural America where that is becoming an actual way to service your customers. And so then the question is, how do you best incentivize the broadband providers to place that broadband entity where it is needed? And I think we don't really have a very clear picture because we have so many multiple maps that we work on. So realize that's a little geeky, but I think it's important to see if we're going to be throwing a lot of money at this, which the last subsidy bill said $3.2 billion, and the FCC just did a request for comment on where we think we should be spending, the emergency funding, and that's just $3.2 billion in emergency funding. So there's going to be a lot of money. Let's make sure that it's actually getting people attached to broadband, and however we need to get that done.
Thanks for bringing the numbers in, the billion in, and in our last discussion on this session, the topic 2 in December, we actually had members of the industry. Chip Pickering of Encompass actually was the one who said that he was expecting numbers on the order of 80 billion in a broadband funding. Now, again, that's one person saying this number, but I'm just, do you have thoughts on the right number if we're talking funding for broadband? Shane or Chris? And
numbers are crazy these days. I was just looking at the last 3 bills that we saw the most recent past Congress, pass. So I don't have a good handle on that. And I think one of the reasons I don't is I look at so many different derivatives of this problem, and I don't see a median way that we are managing how we're trying to reach the goal. And so getting the numbers to match the goal, I think, is probably a big part of what this administration will want to do to make sure, where are we seeing, potentially, as Chris mentioned, are there redlining issues? Where are they? How do we best manage through those? But I still am always going to be a big believer that we should give the broadband providers the ability to invest in facilities, because as we've seen, especially during the pandemic in Europe, where they have a different way of managing this, and they are very prescriptive about how it goes, is they're having troubles with their broadband. In most areas, our trouble may be unserved or underserved, but the people that are served have very good broadband. So getting the best quality broadband as far as possible is what I would like to see those dollars do.
Okay, let's get Josh into the conversation here. So one of the documents you shared, which we have posted on the page for this, you may be watching it on Broadband Breakfast, and you see just down below, you'll see a link, and it's about OTI's, Open Technology Institute's policy proposals. Would you care to summarize those, or say another word about OTI and your approach to broadband and how you see broadband fitting into the priorities legislatively for the next Congress? Joshua.
Sure. Well, in terms of closing the digital divide, it's a top priority for OTI, and we really see it as a three-legged stool. It's, of course, there's the access questions that we've been discussing. There's also a huge affordability question. And then lastly, digital literacy and skills. We have to tackle all three of those things. On the access question, there's been, I think, a lot of focus for years, and I think consensus that we need an infrastructure package. We need help for network build out in unserved areas, both rural and urban, because there are digital deserts all across the country. And that's years overdue. I think the $80 billion figure that Chip Pickering mentioned comes from one of the bills that the House passed last year, the Moving Forward Act, that included $80 billion for broadband infrastructure. But the second leg of that is affordability. And that's a real crisis that up until really just the past few weeks has not been addressed nearly as much. I say the last few weeks because the big turning point in that was the passage of this stimulus bill in December that included the $3.2 billion for an affordability subsidy that we haven't had before. That's a really big part of this, and implementing that program quickly and successfully is a top priority for us over these next few months. We've also been strong advocates for better broadband data since our founding. Of course, like, as you mentioned, we worked with MLab on speed data, and the mapping is one piece of it. But as this new $3.2 billion for affordability shows, we don't actually need better maps for that. What we need is pricing data. As flawed as the FCC's maps are, they have no data on the cost of broadband, and no government agency collects that. And the high cost of this service is the leading cause of the digital divide. And for many, many people is why they don't have internet access, is why there are so many students trying to connect to classes in parking lots right now. So that's a huge piece of it, and getting better data on not just the maps, but the price and availability of broadband is key. And that third leg of this, though, is digital literacy and the need for skills, which also gets very overlooked. But that's where we need the Digital Equity Act passed. Congress passed that. The House passed that last year. We'd love to see the Senate pass that. And that's really addressing the core issue of, once you get past network availability, once you get past the affordability issue, you need the skills. And seemingly every day there's another example of why digital literacy matters. Just this week now, we're seeing with vaccine distributions in Florida, they're using Eventbrite to have elderly people try to sign up for limited access to vaccines. People don't have the skills in many cases to even sign up for Eventbrite, let alone access it. So we really need to make sure that we're hitting all three pieces of those immediately and comprehensively.
Thank you for bringing this issue of data, and also the three prongs: the access, the affordability, and the digital skills into the mix. I mean, many participants may know that Broadband Breakfast actually founded as Broadband Census 12 years ago, and the goal has been at the time to collect speeds, prices, availability, reliability, and competition data. So it's shocking that to this day we don't have the merger of the access and the availability with the speed, or I should say with the pricing data. Many have begun to put speed in, and so that's really key. So let me actually kind of tee up our next topic on broadband to all of you with a reminder about the framework of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARRA, of 2009, the bill that passed in February of 2009. The incoming Obama administration supported. It had certain funds, $7.2 billion for broadband, but it really approached it in terms of, we need infrastructure, we need training, kind of skills, if you will, and we also need to have mapping, right? That was the other big component of it. So how much of that thinking is passé? What should be the approach? There's other things in the mix that we've identified, digital tools, right? I also want to bring into this conversation the Accessible, Affordable Internet for All Act that Clyburn, House Majority Whip Clyburn, and has supported, and it's also got a companion in the Senate. How will those measures factor into this? So let's kind of go to this too, and anyone who wants to dive in, feel free. What's the right framework for thinking about the way to wrestle with this issue of broadband as so many opportunities are open, it seems?
Well, I can start. I think you're hearing a lot of agreement here, actually. And if you're looking back at what happened with the Recovery Act from 2009, certainly, while it had some success in funding, especially middle mile projects through the BTOP program, and made some investment, what we also found is that there was not, certainly there wasn't the dollar amount investment that was projected at the time to fully close the digital divide. The mapping, is something that Congress has only just started in the last year or so to really address. And so while they may have identified it, they did not implement the sort of granularity and quality of data, like Josh was talking about, the varied types of data that's needed to be collected to have accurate maps that help us make sure that everyone is connected. So there really was, while there was an understanding of the need to connect everyone, there really wasn't the political will to invest the dollars that were needed, the dollars that were described in the National Broadband Plan a decade ago, and the quality of oversight that Josh was describing to really accomplish it. So my hope is that with this new administration, that the pandemic has really shone a light on the need in a way that all communities are really going to demand that level of political will, that level of action by the government to invest the dollars that are needed. 80 billion has been discussed, 100 billion has been discussed, but also the oversight, the authority at an agency like the FCC to look into the other aspects beyond funding that are keeping folks from being connected. And that takes oversight, that takes study, in a lot of various forms of policy, whether you're talking about competition policy, and the fact that many folks have very few choices for broadband. Maybe the community can't get a provider to come and provide service even with a subsidy, and so they're looking at other options like investment from the local government. These are all things that need to be looked at so that we take every option to get broadband deployed.
Joshua, what are your thoughts on open access and on ways to ensure that as there's more competition, or I guess I should say, how would you approach this question of competition? And if there is going to be a federal support, what should the rules around that be?
Sure. Well, we're very supportive of open access networks, and in the absence of government collection of pricing data, OTI has endeavored to find what information we can that's publicly available through what we call our cost of connectivity studies. And we just published our most recent version of that in July. It's frankly a big endeavor. It took us a year to collect the data. It's something we would love to have put out of business and have the government just do instead. But one of the big findings from that was that the most affordable internet access in many cities, we surveyed, I think, 760 plans across North America, Europe, and Asia. And the most affordable US market was a small town called Ammon, Idaho, where they have by far some of the most affordable access, not just in the US, but in the world. And they have an open access municipal network where there are dozens of very affordable fast services, some as little as $10 a month. And importantly, there's competition. So there's virtually no switching costs. Unlike anywhere else where switching your internet provider, if you're fortunate enough to have more than one option, requires lengthy installation appointments, among other things. In Ammon, Idaho, all you have to do is go to the city's website and click one of the many of the dozens of other providers, and that's enabled because of the open access network. So we'd love to see many more networks like that built, but one of the first steps to ensuring that is eliminating the state level barriers to municipal networks in all 50 states. And that's a really key thing that is long overdue. We're very pleased to see that was put in the DNC party platform, explicitly calling out that they want to federally eliminate those muni state bans, and also was passed by the House, once again, in that Moving Forward Act back in July. So I think open access, can't say enough about it, but there's a lot of barriers that need to be removed before we can see them flourish throughout the country.
Yeah, I'm sure Chris agrees with that. Shane, do you too, or do you have reservations? Talk a little bit about this point.
Sure. So I talked to the Phoenix Center, to George Ford and Larry Spivak about this summer, because I didn't have a complete understanding about this. And just full disclosure, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska. I grew up with an ILEC because we were a little bit of an area where people, even though we were a state capital and we had a lot of universities, actually 5 colleges and university there, weren't the top of the line of where people wanted to spend money. So I always noticed that our system was different than when I would go visit my relatives because of just the way that things were getting developed. So the question of, why shouldn't we just let people choose how they want it, to get their best possibility? And is it maybe in the, in a city form of, going with the municipal route? And the studies that they shared with me, and I've done more, studying on, is you sometimes get a great start, and then the interest in it tends to peter out, and you end up with these. You've had cities that actually have sold their systems back to a commercial entity for like $1 because it costs them more to keep the upkeep of the equipment, which is part of, if you're going to have that process, you need to talk about how are you going to manage and assure that your assets stay current. Because when it comes to networks, the most important thing is that your network is designed for the type of digital entities you want to have on top of it. So if a municipality is planning for that, I think that's great. This isn't only in the broadband space. I've talked to a lot of people on city planning about this, and the fact that we don't do very good asset management that talks about how we want to make sure that we put money aside to make sure we're doing the upgrades that are needed is a huge challenge for municipalities. And so that is, it's just my challenge question, I guess, on that is to make sure that when we're doing this, we're being fully understanding of, having a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year plan on the upkeep of what's needed. Otherwise, you have a system that isn't going to have the speeds that you need to be able to use all the digital opportunities that are out there.
I should note that we've been doing a series of articles and reporting together with muninetworks.org, and Christopher Mitchell is an awesome resource. And whenever there's anything mentioned about the economics or unfortunate economics, I will turn to Chris and ask him to address it. And he always has a great answer. So, I mean, I don't know the who's and wows of whatever of each one of these, but I think it is important that we are potentially at a point where the dynamic has shifted. And I think, it would be quite a change, or it could be quite a change to have a provision that says states cannot bar municipalities from doing broadband. I think what we may see a lot more of, and this is a topic we're very interested in at Broadband Breakfast, is open access networks, where the city may have a role in that underlying, land use utility, but you have lots of private companies offering services. Like Josh has mentioned, the Ammon, Idaho model, where you have an open access network there. Utopia Fiber is another great example in Utah, the Utah Open Infrastructure Agency. And we're seeing more and more of these in other parts of the country and world. But I'm happy to entertain more comments on this. Let's broaden our discussion to some other topics too. Chris, do you want to jump in first on this point, though?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, these are all good points because, you cited Chris Mitchell before I could. He really has done a great job of analyzing, there are gold standard efforts like Ammon, Idaho, and there are communities who have messed up in their investments, and maybe they end up selling back to a private provider. There are also private providers who have not maintained and upgraded or maintained their networks to a quality where there are outages as well. And so, whether you're talking about a municipal provider, whether you're talking about open access networks, which as you said, I definitely agree with Josh on, are a great option, can bring competition to a community. My community, Alexandria, Virginia, we're investing in a backbone network that can invite in different companies as well right now, or the private sector. All of them would have a responsibility and really have to live up to certain standards of maintaining the quality of the network. And that's where I think, having some level of oversight and understanding of what that quality level is important from a regulator like the FCC.
And our audience is definitely getting exercised over this point. Leslie McNulty writes, investor-owned broadband providers don't maintain their systems adequately. So that's actually an excellent point. We look at some of the major telecom companies that are in bankruptcy right now that are investor-owned. So I don't think we should kind of close the book on that. We're also getting some questions about Fed intervention and state policy level, the role of states and Fed. And I don't want to ask specifically, but feel free to work that into your answers. I definitely want to get to this question of net neutrality and privacy and Section 230, right? And why do I lump those together? Well, because they're controversial issues that everyone always says needs to get addressed. And I've actually been on the record quite a bit as saying that the ping pong, one administration pulling net neutrality, another administration putting it. We've already gone through this 3 times. We're about to go through it a 4th time, unless Congress were to come in and address this issue so that the regulatory agency, the FCC, doesn't need to, follow, and we'll go by our Chevron deference rule, where the agency has the ability to change as long as Congress hasn't given any directions otherwise. So let me throw it out to each of you. What are your thoughts? What will happen and what should happen on these 3 big topics: net neutrality, privacy, and Section 230 from a congressional legislative angle? Chris, Shane, Josh, whoever wants to jump
Happy
in.
to start. On net neutrality, I think all of those issues the time has passed. We need to move forward to things that we really need to be focusing on, like we did at the beginning of this conversation. Blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization. The people that we've seen blocking and throttling have actually been the edge providers with social media and the issues around that, which is why we've gotten into the Section 230 discussion. Paid prioritization, we have seen there are reasons why you do want to give certain entities fast lanes. We're seeing that with with medical. We're seeing that potentially with being able to help schools have faster broadband when they can get these kids back into school, which is really important. And then that also gets us to the question of the privacy element. I candidly don't believe that there is privacy anymore. I am a big believer in data, how we manage data and how we have rules around data. I think we should be transparent, and we need to be 100% accountable to whatever it is that you say your guidance is. If you want to say I'm the devil and I'm taking all of your information, I will believe you. But you need to tell me that up front when I'm giving you my information. So the other challenge with privacy is we're seeing over in Europe and some of the rules around GDPR is, do you know who loves privacy? Criminals. Because when you are not, I don't have to make it public who you are when you're actually registering your domain name or you're on a network and I can't tell who you are. I can't go after you to prosecute you for the bad things that you're doing online. So there's always 2 sides to this. And as much as I believe in the need for a data protection bill, that we need to be thinking about when we're doing privacy. There's other people that love privacy too that aren't meeting our end goal.
Well, there's a lot there to jump into. First of all, the comparison of blocking and throttling on broadband networks versus blocking and throttling on that Shane made, blocking and throttling on platforms. Those are 2 different issues. One, a website or a web service or a digital platform, it would be hard to argue that it is essentialist broadband connectivity. If you don't like Facebook, you can, and hopefully, and then people we find, are going to other social networks where people don't have those sorts of choices when it comes to broadband providers, and the data proves that out. So it is critically important, with the cost that it takes to deploy an essential network like broadband, that we have net neutrality rules. While we've been without them, there's a strong record of clear net neutrality violations and questionable net neutrality violations that should be, but have not been investigated by an agency because the FCC is basically eliminated its rules and its authority to look after them. So, you started by talking about the importance of what can Congress do. I would, if Congress created a strong net neutrality bill tomorrow, that would be fantastic. But unfortunately, over the last 2 years, all we've heard is talk from the Senate. They have had no hearings. They've had no public action to actually engage on creating that sort of protection. And so I would welcome the FCC to jump back in. Unfortunately, it is a ping pong match with a new administration, but at least to have them try and protect consumers, I think would be important on net neutrality. And then to deal with the concerns around content moderation, whether speech is being taken down or not, and for what reasons on digital platforms, is a separate issue that I would also love to see investigated and looked at by members of Congress. I don't think we need to get rid of Section 230 to address that. In fact, Section 230 promotes the moderation of content, encourages platforms to be able to take down harmful content. It doesn't touch illegal content because it's already illegal, but content that may be bullying, content that may be offensive or hateful, content that may be violent or obscene. This is what Section 230 promotes. And to have choices in the marketplace is really what is most important, because if you don't like how a dominant platform is moderating, we need to have alternatives for where you can go. And we're seeing that on political ideology right now with platforms that I probably would never go on, like 8chan or Parler, where you're seeing white supremacist content, but they are very clear that they do not have content moderation rules, and Section 230 gives them the freedom to do that. That's a marketplace that we want to promote. So those are my thoughts on those two.
Shane, let me just try to narrow these issues a bit here. So it's a common conservative argument that we don't need net neutrality rules because we should tackle them on a case-by-case basis from competition law. It seems to me that really that argument stares me in the face on this Section 230 issue. I mean, what is the conceivable justification for addressing Section 230 in the context of a regulation as opposed to addressing from an anti-competitive perspective what a particular platform is or isn't doing? Do you have thoughts on that or reactions to Chris on his critique of your viewpoint there?
So actually on Section 230, it might be a little colloquial, but it reminds me of, being somebody who was around in the 90s and dealing with the Clean Air Act, because everybody always wanted the Clean Air Act open for their one slivered item that was a bothersome thing, but the rest of it should stand. And I feel like we have that same challenge with Section 230. I concur with Chris. I don't think that Section 230 should be removed. I think we should really review, though, some of the regulations around content to make sure that unlawful and illegal content can be appropriately addressed. And I think that there are other things that can do that besides Section 230. Section 230 has become a blanket item, sort of like net neutrality. Net neutrality, I don't disagree that there are things that we should make sure that people have, fair and equal access, but I don't think that blocking and throttling from the most part has happened at a level that people were concerned about with net neutrality. I worry that the phrase net neutrality doesn't actually mean much. It's a bumper sticker and it makes certain people happy, but I really want us to address the issues that are problems moving forward. And going back actually to our earlier conversation about municipalities, I think a lot of this can really be helped with a better information flow altogether. So we have a full understanding of what it is that we're discussing and how we're trying to solve them and what problem we're solving for. And so I will be curious if Section 230 stays with the fervor that it's had over the last couple months because of the current president and the way that he has managed it. And I think I do also agree that I think net neutrality eventually needs to be a legislative issue to get resolved.
Joshua, let's hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I would just say, as much as these three issues are obviously high profile and in some cases controversial, I don't want us to necessarily conflate all of them. I would pull out net neutrality pretty clearly. There is clear consensus that net neutrality has to get done from the incoming Biden administration, from this Congress. And you just need to look to what happened in the last Congress. The very first thing that came out of the Democratic controlled House through the Energy and Commerce Committee was the Save the Net Act to restore net neutrality rules, because it was seen as just a necessary thing that had to be done. And every member of the Democratic caucus voted for it. And we've seen this very extensively documented in everything coming out of the Biden campaign and the transition team. The repeal of those net neutrality rules was one of the most deeply unpopular things that the Trump administration did. When you look at the incredible popular outcry after that happened, it was some 22 million comments flooded the FCC. That is a record for any regulatory proceeding in any agency in the history of the federal government. So this is wildly unpopular, and that this was all happening before the pandemic started. Since the pandemic now, it's, I think, unquestionably clear that broadband is a utility and we need to classify it, in this case, reclassify it as such. So I think the political reality is simply there and it's inevitable. Whether it goes through the FCC or Congress remains to be seen, but whoever I think is in charge of the FCC, whatever happens with Congress, net neutrality is widely understood to be a necessary thing that needs to be addressed and restored very quickly as part of the response to the pandemic, because we've had a very toothless federal government right now, unable to respond to ensuring that people have access during the pandemic to the internet, in large part because the Trump administration wholly abdicated its authority over broadband providers when they repealed those net neutrality rules. So as much as privacy in Section 230, and frankly, even broadband mapping is often brought into this in some cases as a distraction. I do think that the net neutrality issue is a top priority on its own in 2021.
But how does it get past Congress without including other items? Or maybe you're suggesting it's just an FCC matter, and you don't think it needs to go and get dealt with by Congress.
It can be either, and I think the model here is what we saw 2 years ago. I mean, the Save the Net Act went on its own. Net neutrality was its own bill. Everything else went separately legislatively. But I think there's still a question of whether or not the FCC goes first, or frankly, states. California has its strong net neutrality law. New York and many other states are looking at passing strong net neutrality laws that are notably even stronger than the 2015 rules that we're looking to restore. And they're all starting their legislative sessions in the next few weeks.
Shane, let's wrap this topic. What is your take on what you've just heard about non-controversial net neutrality rules?
I don't have any idea why we think it's not controversial. And I love that there's consensus amongst the Biden campaign. So that's how we're going to decide things. But I do think that we've seen the states that are passing their own net neutrality bills start to have problems with people wanting to invest in them. When you decide to set what they think is the floor, it becomes the ceiling. And what we have realized, the reason why we have such good broadband connectivity where we have it, which is actually pretty widely adopted, is that we've allowed people to come in and invest at a great level. I'm a huge speed test junkie. And so whenever I go places, I'm always fascinated to see when people think that they think they need speeds at an incredible level that they can usually get most of what they want, not at the speed that they're demanding. And then they're always shocked to see how much they actually have. So I think we need to deal with facts here. We need to deal with where are the areas where we want to be spending money to make sure that we're getting that broadband connectivity, because it's vital to educating kids. It's vital to making sure that people are able to continue to work from at home or at work like you are right now. But I don't think that talking about this in a really rhetorical way is going to make this go forward. I would be very saddened that this continues to be a political football rather than saying that let's fix the broadband issues and move on so we can continue the digital economy.
So no one took me up on the privacy end of this, but we've just seen a huge hack of government computers over the last 2 weeks. It's been public. Shane, I know you've devoted a lot of attention to cybersecurity issues. Could you just speak to how this issue is going to force itself on the agenda, whether we like it or not? And I certainly like Chris and Josh's thoughts as well on how privacy and security, or at least the security piece of it, are policy issues, or are they policy issues? Let me ask it that way, Shane.
Part of our challenge on cybersecurity is that we have used the delineation that has been in the government for years, that things that are either Defense Department or specifically federal or considered a government entity do have a difficult time sharing information with commercial entities. The creation of CISA over at the Department of Homeland Security started to bridge this gap. But this is one of the reasons, actually going back to the Obama administration, that they realized that when we had an attack by the Iranians, they saw that we were unable to defend our own banks because of the way our laws were structured. And so they went after a lot of the financial institutions and were able to do ransomware, and the banks were not able to get the help of the federal government, nor were they able to signal across where we should be looking for this to happen. So the current SolarWinds situation is we're seeing both how it's a huge issue for Microsoft. There's a bunch of companies that has just recently come out in the last couple of days were hit with this issue. We can't go with the old school way of saying we're going to build a big moat and then assume that everything that's inside the castle is secure. And we need to look at this. There are some people that are huge believers in zero trust. You need to constantly go back to having to identify and authenticate, which is it's a very good start, but there are other things that we need to be doing in this space. And we need to make cybersecurity a priority as we're putting more and more of our government and our infrastructure into cloud computing, which is fantastic. And it gives us huge leverage on our the economic value of the digital economy, but it has to be safe. So if it's not safe, people aren't going to trust it, and it will make us actually take a big step back from where we are currently going. And there's actually some interesting things about, Bitcoin's had a huge hit on, major uptake in the financial community recently, but Bitcoin also is one of the reasons why ransomware is having the headway that it is right
now. Chris or Josh, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I think Shane's broader point is really important, that it's important that this is a joint effort across stakeholders, including government and industry and consumers. The weakest link point about cybersecurity is, I think, the most important, and it's one that we've made when it comes to setting up infrastructure, network infrastructure, including how spectrum is used and the rules around spectrum use, that if there is a weak link in our society, whether it's in the government, whether it's in industry, or whether it's on the consumer side, it is a way for foreign governments to entangle and get in. So it needs to be a collaborative effort. We need to have continually upgraded standards. And while we haven't done much work on it, I think those are good guideposts for any sort of conversation with the industry. And you asked about privacy, and which, privacy on the data side of an individual. Shane may not be very privacy sensitive, but some folks are, and so there's a whole separate effort that still needs to move forward on passing comprehensive consumer privacy, where there can be rules around limiting the amount of data that consumers have taken and collected on them by companies, and that limitation will at least protect consumers in the marketplace when and if there are breaches around cybersecurity concerns.
Just a point of clarification, the reason why I'm big on data versus privacy is that lawyers know what to do about data. And when you start talking about privacy, they get a little squishy, and that doesn't help the discussions that we're in. And I am a full believer that if you want to say, don't collect any of my information, and you agree to do that, you have to not collect information. So it is a delineation that's really just about vocabulary, but the vocabulary matters. And that's why I feel like sometimes if we take the issue, my mom's a huge privacy problem. I constantly having to have this discussion with her, but it helps us get to where we need to go, which is, I think we need federal legislation that brings us to a better place. Right now we're seeing what's happening in California is the tail that's wagging the dog on privacy. However, we did see that in the challenges around if your data was compromised, and there are people around the world that were notified if their credit cards were, somebody was hacked because of the California law. So we know that it has an effect, but we need to have a common effect around this, I think, on the federal privacy law. I'd call it data.
So I want to get in a couple more questions here as we have 8 more minutes before we end. A lot of people are asking about states versus federal and block grants. So let's go back to our broadband discussion. Is it more effective for if you had to choose one of these 3, for the federal government to give it out through kind of merit grants, or through block grants to states, or through a process like a reverse auction, like has been done with some of the recent government awards, or another method? What are some of your thoughts about the block grant approach to getting funds for broadband out? Josh, let's let you go first.
Well, I think, when it comes to any method of money disbursement, the data does really matter. And we just had, this RDOF process last month at the FCC, where frankly, a lot of the funds that were dispersed seemed to not go to rural areas. That was the R in RDOF. But some of that does trace back to, Shane's point on broadband mapping, and we do need better maps. But I think, on that question though, it's really important to note that we can't let the maps and the data itself stop us from doing everything else. You mentioned the Recovery Act back in 2009, supposedly supposed to create the national broadband map that we still 11 years later don't have. And that's a huge problem. And OTI that was one of the first things we did in 2009 as an organization was file something at the FCC on these maps. And for many years, we were some of the lone people fighting for more granular data, while many, many folks who suddenly in the last couple of years support better maps were totally opposed to, saying that was too burdensome on industry. So it's shameful that it's taken us this long to get to this point, but I think it's important to note that fixing the data and the maps, that's not even step 1 to closing the digital divide, that's step 0. Back in the 1930s with rural electrification, they did not spend a decade developing a map of where the electric grid was. So it's taken far too long for us to do that. And I am concerned that for example, Chairman Pai last year, when he had a sudden conversion and now cares about fixing the maps, described fixing them as our moonshot, as something that we need to get done in the next 3 to 5 years. But it's not a moonshot. This is something that simply should have been done a long time ago. And I do worry that the focus now on the maps and the data, I hear many people say this is their plan to close the digital divide, is just fix the maps by 2022 and we'll move on. But it's really not that. So we need better data, but we have to walk and chew them at the same time, and we can't let this issue continue to drag on for years.
One of our listeners, Bob Jackson, notes the considering reconstituting the Congressional Office of Technology, right? That occasionally comes up as creating a new center of expertise, knowledge within the legislature, as opposed to necessarily pushing everything down to the FCC. So anyway, continue on some of your thoughts on states versus federal. Chris, do you have perspective on this?
I agree with what Josh said. I mean, a block grant basically just pushes the distribution of the funds down to the state level. At a certain point, like Josh was saying, you have to have clear technical and detailed knowledge of where you're going to deploy and why. And so the maps are foundational. And I don't see any problem with having a federal mandate with the power of the federal government to deploy, to invest, and to subsidize based on national mapping, based on mapping that's jointly put together at the joint state and federal level. At a certain point, Congress, I worry about Congress giving out block grants and not getting its hands dirty and understanding on whether or not we're solving the problem or not. And so, there are a lot of ways to give out funding, but those are some of the things I worry about if you're looking at some sort of block grant program. There's such a need for federal oversight over broadband issues, whether it's deployment and digital divide or whether it's other issues, that it just makes sense to continue to utilize something like an expert agency at the FCC. Does Congress, you talked about the Office of Technology for Congress, certainly that can help Congress members understand and have greater knowledge about these issues. But when it comes to the day-to-day implementation and promotion of investment dollars and accountability on how those dollars are used and accountability on the quality of the networks that are being provided, I think an FCC is a clear solution that can and should work, and has been used with other utilities in the past.
Another point from one of our listeners, Teresa Ferguson, is that most states have better maps than the FCC. And I remind everyone watching that the plan that was to build the broadband map, and it was operational for some short period of time, was a collaborative effort of states reporting to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration and the FCC. So those two were sort of working hand in hand for that limited period of time. We had a working map. So Shane, I know you'll have some thoughts.
I would say your point is noteworthy, because when the federal government, with its vast resources and its ability to invest and subsidize, does not take action, local and state communities try to do what they can. Some are better at it than others, and that's led to the municipal broadband efforts. It's led to the state mapping efforts. We need to have everyone valued, not just one state doing it well and another state doing it poorly, or when we're supporting state and local efforts, setting the standards that help them do it well, to the point about making sure that municipal projects are executed properly.
So my reason for bringing up mapping at the very beginning of this conversation is information flow. And I also know, as we're all kind of creatures of Washington, that one of the challenges with the mapping has been jurisdiction. It's the same problem we had actually with cybersecurity. Is we had just people that had jurisdiction and they wanted money to flow to things that were important to them. And we had the same problem with broadband, just the reason why there's so many maps. Why does USDA use different maps from the FCC, and the states have different maps and they're not all mapping together? And Teresa's probably right. I mean, imagine North Carolina has a better understanding of where their assets lie than parts of the federal government. So, but in this day of this digital era, we shouldn't be even having this conversation. That's what amazes me. My fellow colleagues over at the Technology Policy Institute have been trying to do this really on the back of one computer, and just getting the analytics right to say, can we just figure out where all the touch points are? And then we can decide where to go on that. And that's a priority thing. That goes back to the question of availability versus adoption. Is it available? Okay, is it available? Does it cost too much? Or are the people willing? I mean, there's some people that you can give them broadband, they don't want it. It seems weird, but they do exist. But let's find out then, like, stop trying to send 7 nodes to the one person who really doesn't care if they have it, and then find out that these people over here don't have access to it at all. So the point of the mapping is just to have the information source to make sure that we're sending whose ever funds, may they be federal, state, local, or if it's finding an incentive for investment dollars, to make sure that we're covering as many people as possible if that is our priority, which I think it should be.
Shane, give us 30 seconds closing, and then we'll go to Josh and then Chris for final words too.
So I think actually, I'm a huge proponent of what has gone on with limited regulation in this space. So I hope that we continue to see that the limited regulation has allowed for investment in this area. We will, continue to quibble around the edges around, the importance of the verbiage around things like, privacy and and I really want to get to what's important about net neutrality, which is people want to make sure they have access and full access to the internet. I know that earlier when we discussed, we were talking about China. China is always the thing that you look at and you say, well, this is what happens when you decide who and when and what have the ability to have access to the internet. And I hope that we continue to be the antithesis of that as somebody that has free, open access and making sure that we can get it to as many people as possible.
Thank you for bringing that element in. It certainly is an undercurrent to lots of discussions these days, the Chinese telecommunications companies and their interaction, and the different model that China brings that is, you're rightly pointing out, is not the way American democratic values want to go. So
we have a whole discussion on China. I'd love to do that.
We'll come back to it, Shane. Yes, absolutely. Josh.
Yeah, well, I would just say, going forward now into 2021, we're still in obviously a very difficult situation with the pandemic, as millions of people are suffering through it without internet access. But at least one reason for hope, I think now, is that it's very clear that the government is interested in and realizes this is not only a priority, but their job more than they ever have been. And in particular, voters get it. 10 years ago, I think a lot of voters thought that this was something to just call up your ISP and complain about. They've connected the dots and they get that the digital divide is a failure of public policy, and it's something that voters across the spectrum are demanding action from their elected officials. And we've seen that reflected in a lot of the proposals and a lot of the huge flurry of bills over the past 9 months from both Republicans and Democrats. So looking forward to the new year, I think we're going to have an unprecedented level of action on a lot of long overdue digital divide issues.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing us back to that key issue we're all dealing with. This is why we started this, is because of the pandemic, so we can have ways to talk and communicate and share ideas. Chris, you'll get the closing word here.
Yeah, I guess my last thought is that it's time for Washington to act. I mean, as Shane said, we all work in Washington, and we can get into a lot of the details and we can debate terms and whatnot, but what average citizens know is what's right in front of them. They know how much they're paying for broadband access, or they know if they don't have it, or they know if it goes out a lot, or they know that maybe their provider has told them that their data is going to be capped, and but their data won't be capped if they watch the streaming service that is provided by their broadband provider as opposed to a competitor. And these are all basic things that people have coming in their mail or in their inbox every day, and they understand it. And what they want Washington to do is to cut through all the complicated talk and to actually address some of these problems. So we have a lot of work to do. And the fact that we can reference the ARRA from 2009 or the National Broadband Plan or the multiple mapping efforts shows that there has not been enough political will to dive in and get their hands dirty and solve some of these problems in a way that is helpful to everyone. So we have a lot of work to do in Washington.
Well, thanks for bringing us back to time to act, definitely. Before I close and thank our guests for being with us, I want to remind you that we'll be here again next week on the 13th for our series on our no-nonsense guide to 5G. We'll continue with the session on the adoption and use of 5G broadband. 12 noon Eastern time every Wednesday. We will take a break on Inauguration Day, however. We will not be here that Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, January 27th, we'll be talking about tools for broadband, and we'll actually be talking about mapping rural broadband in particular. So on behalf of Chris Lewis of Public Knowledge, Shane Tews of American Enterprise Institute, and Josh Steger of Open Technology Institute and New America, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. Thank you for being with us, and see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.